Hi everyone, welcome to BRICS Briefs. We are continuing our exploration of China's political and economic development, but this time in relation to Africa. The Belt and Road Initiative is a large part of the story that encompasses also the BRICS initiative. As we have explained in various in the previous shows about the real origins of BRICS. To help us with this journey, we have another special guest who we think will be able to give you an exclusive and a detailed analysis of the China-Africa story. In this episode, we'll cover the topics of the debt trap narrative, investment structures, public, private, and foreign, the real China-Africa development partnership story, the China-South Africa development partnership story, and the challenges of security in development goals. Okay, here we go. Welcome everyone.
Hello, Clive. Hello, Jana.
Hi, guys.
I saw I'm messing with the buttons here, so just bear with me. Our special guest tonight is Jana De Kluiver from the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa, an international relations professional specializing in political economy and geopolitical risk. Jana is the author of many publications and presentations. She is the figure of many media engagements over the last 2 to 3 years, which shows her as a highly skilled and effective analyst and researcher. She is currently doing her Doctorate of Philosophy in Political Science. A real privilege to have you on, Jana. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Clive. You make me sound very, very professional.
Excellent.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Before we start, I'm going to run a clip that our producer has made, and I think it's just to introduce it. So let's roll that, okay? Here we go.
With Africa has been a topic of significant interest and debate over recent decades. As Beijing adjusts its strategic priorities, the continent stands at the crossroads of these evolving dynamics. Historically, China's interest in Africa has been driven by a need for resources, market expansion, and geopolitical support. However, post-COVID-19, the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the tech economic rivalry with the United States have reshaped these relationships. China's approach to Africa has shifted from public sector loans for large infrastructure projects to a more diversified investment strategy. The 2021 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation highlighted new priorities: reducing public loans in favor of mobilizing private finance, focusing on energy and environmental governance, and establishing China as a leader of the Global South through development and security initiatives. One of the most debated topics is the debt trap narrative. Critics argue that China's lending practices lead to unsustainable debt levels in African countries, potentially compromising their sovereignty. However, proponents point out that Chinese loans have filled a critical gap in infrastructure financing that Western entities were unwilling to address. Today's guest, Jana De Kluiver, will provide a balanced assessment of these claims, examining the credibility of the debt trap narrative and its implication for Africa's economic future. China's evolving interest in African energy resources has shifted from oil to gas and minerals essential for renewable energy technologies. Africa, rich in minerals like cobalt, manganese, and lithium from countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, is key to China's green energy ambitions. Additionally, China's strategic engagement aims to position itself as a global leader in energy governance, highlighted by the 2021 FOCAC Joint Declaration on Cooperation and Green Energy Projects. Diplomatically, Africa's importance to China cannot be overstated. With a significant proportion of votes in international organizations, Africa is pivotal in China's strategy to reshape global governance frameworks. This has led to China's support for the creation of alternative global financial institutions, such as the New Development Bank and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. In an exciting development, China has fixed the dates for the 9th Forum on China-African Cooperation Summit. The summit will take place in Beijing from September the 3rd to 8th, 2024. This event promises to be significant, featuring a plenary session co-chaired by President Xi Jinping and an African leader and a China-Africa Entrepreneurs Conference. The upcoming summit will also emphasize the Global Development Initiative, aiming to build a community of shared future. Facing criticisms, China is shifting from mega projects to high-quality projects that emphasize economic viability, local benefits, and eco-friendliness. Despite the pledge of $40 billion in financial support to Africa being lower than the previous summit's $60 billion, the focus remains on impactful and sustainable development. To delve deeper into these complex dynamics, we have Jana De Kluiver from the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. Jana is an expert in political economy and geopolitical risk, with numerous publications and media engagements to her name. She is currently pursuing a doctorate in political science and brings a wealth of knowledge on China's strategic investments in Africa.
There we go. Hopefully there's a bit of an introduction, right? Just to get an idea. Go ahead, Anastasia.
Yes, I want to welcome all our viewers. I hope we are enough to start the discussion. And taking into account that the presentation, I want to start with a direct question to Jana. Is China a sincere friend of Africa?
Thank you for the great introduction, and I think the video did a lot of the hard work for me in introducing the topic. I think the question, is China a sincere friend to Africa, is very loaded. Maybe I'm a bit pessimistic, but I think in international relations, oftentimes of states, there are very little sincere friends. In terms of, I think China's engagement with Africa has had benefits. I also think it has had some pitfalls. I think China is very well aware of the role that Africa can play within its own rise in the global economy and the importance of maintaining this relationship. In terms of sincere friend, just out of my own pessimistic view of it, I wouldn't go as far, but I definitely say that it is a very convenient alliance that Beijing sees a lot of value in.
I'm absolutely agree with the statement that there is no friends in politics.
Yeah.
There are alliances, there are mutual benefits, but friendship is something else from the other area. So China and Africa, yes, it's we are not talking about friendship, so it's a mutual benefit for both.
No, I certainly think so. And I think it's important for African countries also to keep that in mind. Today, this might be beneficial. We don't know where the relationship will stand in 20, 30, 50 years from now. So it's always important to continually reassess it and see what is the best in Africa's interest in terms of engaging with these external actors, be it the US, be it China, be it India.
I know from my own research, especially in the Belt and Road Initiative and the original Four Powers Agreement that was proposed by Lyndon LaRouche, that one of the main principles was that the win-win sort of principle. And it was based on each country doing what was in the interest of the other country, rather than, as we just sort of went over, each country in their own interests, because that doesn't really make for a friendship, between people. But I think that's very difficult, especially in the political climate. So I totally know. I think I know where you're coming from, Jana. Especially being a professional in your field, and the research. So I think it's relatively understandable, and I think professionals would understand that too. And straight into it. The debt trap narrative, right? It's been a narrative that's been poured over for quite a while. It's been a few years, been a lot of debunking. But how credible is the debt trap narrative surrounding China's investment activities in Africa, especially during the early phases of the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you provide a balanced assessment of these claims?
I can try my best to provide a balanced assessment. I think what's always very interesting is if you take it back to its root, which was essentially the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, that because they defaulted on a loan, it was ultimately the asset was handed over to a Chinese construction company on a 99-year lease. And I think shortly afterwards, the term debt trap diplomacy absolutely went viral. And it became such a catchphrase attached to, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. So at its core, what the debt trap diplomacy implies is that China would extend loans, knowing full well that the country would ultimately not be able to repay it. And once the country is not able to repay it, they would then make certain concessions towards them. So this, in terms of countries being able to still own their own infrastructure and having that sovereignty, that came very much into question with the debt trap diplomacy narrative. Now, a lot of studies have been done on this, and it has been, in my opinion, some people might disagree, but debunked. That being said, it doesn't mean that Chinese lending to Africa is perfect and there has been no pitfalls, but in terms of the debt trap diplomacy, oftentimes filing in a similar conversation that you'd have regarding the new colonial tendencies of these China engagement, that in a lot of ways has been debunked. So I would say, for example, there's been cases in Ethiopia, for example, where they successfully restructured loan agreements and the country retained ownership of the assets. However, sometimes it has been seen that these Chinese projects, especially through the BRI, especially in its early ages and its early days, didn't necessarily have all of the due diligence required to make sure that these projects were sustainable within an African context. Now, this can be a very complex conversation to have because, of course, some analysts would argue that these infrastructure investments were never intended to be profitable. It was intended towards the long-term development of these African economies. But however, if a gigantic railway or highway is built, but it's in a community where there's very few cars and there's not really the financial means to pay for the toll gates to even use the infrastructure, it becomes very difficult. So I think there were some stumbling blocks when these projects were just rolled out in the African context and understanding what really works for Africa. So I think that is where the debt trap diplomacy narrative kind of came in. A lot of work has been done in pushing it to the side because at the end of the day, it's not a constructive narrative. It takes away from the more important conversations regarding what the actual problems are.
Yeah, which is development for the people. Yeah.
I find it.
Ahead, Ainsley.
I find it even, well, it's normal then when China started to invest into something new for them, African continent. Of course, it was very difficult to avoid any mistakes, as Jana says, that maybe they were shifting from one side to another, just trying to find the balance, right balance that suits that of this country. Because Africa, how many countries, how many nations we have, and they're all unique. What work in South Africa may not work in Zimbabwe, for example. So, but yeah, so they invested a lot. We know they invested a lot, but we know that China, in general, they invest state money. They are not private company. They trying to invest their state money. But what about private sector? Well, our question is then, given the historical context of commercial warfare, genocide, and economic suppression in Africa, DMB, what strategies would you recommend for the private sector to manage geopolitical risks and complexities in the political economy?
So something I found very interesting, just in terms of China as an investing actor on the African continent, as opposed to a state such as the United States, that have a completely different economic structure in terms of your separation of your public and private enterprises when engaging with Africa. I think that's kind of where the space also started to come in, where through, for example, the BRI, although it might be a company, the separation of state and private in China is very difficult to really determine in terms of your state-owned enterprises and your private-owned enterprises that still have a large stake from the government. But the Belt and Road essentially incentivized a lot of this expansion onto the African continent. And this falls into the broader conversation of, in the early days, there were some mistakes. And to get back to the question of how these private sector actors, or even these SOEs in China's case, could have improved their engagement, and something we've learned throughout, for example, the 10 years of the Belt and Road in Africa, is definitely that an increased due diligence is very important in African markets, understanding what the landscape looks like. Something that some research has shown is that, for example, Belt and Road investments tended to be less risk averse than some of your more Western institutions, especially in countries where there are sometimes very turbulent economic and political environments, particularly in terms of corruption as well. And I think this in some ways has been detrimental, where you've seen some contractors taking almost a greased palm approach. We're assimilating towards the corruption structures that are already in place within these countries, and then ultimately reinforcing a lot of the problems that you have been seeing. So I would say, firstly, due diligence and understanding what that specific African country's legislative framework is and how to operate effectively in it. The next one would be a higher level of transparency. This has been something that there has been quite intensive non-disclosure agreements in a lot of these Chinese infrastructure contracts, for example, in an African context. This makes it incredibly difficult for the country's citizens to ultimately hold their governments to account in terms of how these finances are being spent, what these projects are, where they begin, where they end. For example, there's still no complete list of all Belt and Road Initiative projects in Africa. So this lack of transparency makes it very difficult to navigate, especially when you put it in an environment that has already some traces of corruption, for example, or weak state infrastructure in terms of really keeping companies in check. So I would say those are very important things, and this might have to come from the company itself, as it won't necessarily come from the government. And then a third thing I would say, that just as how we've seen these investments roll out the past few years, is a higher level of community engagement. What we eventually saw with a lot of these projects built by Chinese contractors was local discontent. And there's been unfortunate cases where workers have been attacked because of their external involvement within these African communities. So I think it's very important to also make sure that the local population understands what is happening, and that they ultimately consent to having this involvement and how it will impact their daily lives. And I think this is where smaller, more sustainable projects become very important, as we've seen with the shift in terms of China's investment, but also ultimately listening to local communities and also understanding the tribal structures, the community needs, and how all of this fits together in an African landscape. So I think sensitivity towards that is very prevalent for the private sector engaging in Africa.
Well, that's something new for me. I haven't read about any difficulties that you mentioned that any community was against. Could you just give an example where it was happening?
So, for example, in Zambia, I'm speaking under correction, I think it was in a 2021 election campaign. One of the opposition's members ran his campaign very much on an anti-China campaign. There's been anti-China protests against, for example, cheap Chinese goods coming into some communities, and then they feel as though they are being displaced since they can't compete with the lower market rate. So that type of discontent, and of course the issue with a broader debt narrative in terms of going back to the narrative of debt trap diplomacy, how that has been propagated, oftentimes breeds local discontentment. when the country is under debt distress and it's very difficult for average Africans on their day-to-day lives to get what they need to do. And this narrative of debt-trap diplomacy is floating around that paints China as not a very good actor in terms of debt restructuring. It makes it very difficult for that local discontent not to spew over.
Okay, I see. So there are some tensions from country to country, but I think we will be back to this question about the atmosphere from country, how changes the atmosphere from country to country. But that's interesting to know that, because there is a picture we have mostly that an average person has, I think, like me, for example. There is a Chinese company that brings a lot of money into a country, and they construct buildings, hospitals, schools, railways, and everyone is happy. So this is the image we have about when we are talking about Chinese investments, I don't know, in Africa, in Mongolia, everywhere. But as you tell us, that not so rosy the atmosphere is.
Of course, it's a very complex situation, and it's very regional as well. And a lot of it, of course, it has to do with popular narrative, not necessarily what is true, what isn't true. But even, for example, as you mentioned, the hospitals or infrastructure was being constructed. Oftentimes these come with loan agreements, and when the local population isn't privy to understanding what are in these agreements, hidden debts is a big issue as well. And all of a sudden they just find out their government committed them to this huge loan agreement that they don't know how to repay, and it's cutting into public services. That creates a negative sentiment. So I think, of course, it's important to keep in mind the role of African governments in engaging with these things. It's not something where African governments aren't agency-less. They also have a choice in how they choose to engage with the proposals that China is bringing to the table. So obviously it would not be fair to put it solely on China's shoulders, but yes, in some areas there have been that negative sentiment.
Well, Clive, if you allow me, I would like to continue the question about, if we started about talking about the government.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
About local governance. So we see that from country to country, the area is different. So, and how do local governance and political conditions in African countries affect the success or challenges of Chinese infrastructure projects? If we continue talking about that.
Yeah, so I think that's where, and especially with FOCAC coming up as well, I think that's that space where African countries need to do introspection to understand what do we need in our economy, what sectors do we need investment in that's going to ultimately contribute to the goals we have for ourselves. Of course, there's Agenda 2063, that's the African Union's plan for Africa. But of course, every individual African country also has their own needs. So it's within the space that they need to be preemptive in identifying the areas in which they need investment and then come to the table with that. Of course, local governance, it doesn't help that China can construct the best possible bridges and the best possible ports. But if the local economy is not thriving and there's nothing to transport on these railways or to these ports, then ultimately it becomes null and void. So China can be a tool in, and I think this is also something Xi Jinping has stressed before, in terms of Africa needs infrastructure, it needs human capacity development. And this is something that China can assist with, but it can't fix Africa's problems. Only Africa can fix Africa's problems. So that's where I think local governance becomes very important. And also, how are these projects managed? How are these funds spent? If there's this lack of transparency, for example, on the loan agreement, and this can be an issue on China's fault as well, where there is this non-disclosure part of the agreement, it makes it very difficult for civilians to hold their governments to account on how are these funds actually being spent.
Yeah. Well, not only Chinese investments, I think this is the issue for, but also for Western. If we if, for example, I don't know, Americans will come with the same idea to invest, it will be the same question from the locals, from the people, how this project will be managed, and what the benefits they will take lately. But when
Actually,
we want to
sorry,
talk about
Anastasia,
yeah.
we just had the producer just put up a, yes, if we want to read it, from David Nathan. Because, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Anastasia, because you're on a line there, but I want to try and engage the audience as much as possible. He says, the Western propaganda machine runs in tandem with the war machine. IMF loans tend to be inherently tied to corrupted leaders. I'm reading it because people listen sometimes, they don't watch us. If you want to comment on that.
No, definitely. I think I'm definitely not the person. I haven't done research specifically on the connection between IMF investment and corrupt leaders, and having that comparison between your corruption index as well as the engagement with the IMF. Something that I am privy to is studies that have shown that Chinese companies, at least initially in its excursions in Africa, were less risk averse towards engaging in less transparent environments. Something that you oftentimes would have with an IMF loan is certain conditionalities, which can come across as very paternalistic. And a lot of African governments are not necessarily open to this. But it does have some human rights stipulation that, for example, a loan from China would not have. So what we've seen in the past few years is an increased movement away from engagement with these traditionally associated with the West institutions towards more lenders such as China, and increasingly as well the UAE, for example. So I definitely think what I can speak to is in terms of Chinese investments. And there has also been cases where, of course, China has the policy of non-interference in domestic affairs. So they do not necessarily, based on the human rights track record of a leader, for example, they wouldn't disqualify them based on that for getting a loan for the country. Or if the country has a bad human rights track record, that wouldn't discourage China from engaging with this country, which can then, of course, have an enabling effect. So I can't really speak to the IMF's role, because that's not what I specialize in, but that's what we've seen with China, at least.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Anastasia. Sorry to break you.
No, just about governance and political conditions. We know that, we all know that so many countries in the African continent, and some of them are pro-Western countries. They're American allies. Others are in BRICS association. Well, it's not association, so okay, in BRICS countries. Some of them more Chinese, we can say, allies, and we know that in Africa there is a Chinese military base as well.
Yeah.
How do this atmosphere influence on investment climate?
Of course. So I think there's a lot of actors at play. Something that I think a lot of African countries are very vocal about is the fact that we do not want to be, I don't want to say we and speak on behalf of the African continent, but there's this need to not just be a chessboard on which all of these big powers compete for different resources. They would want to be a space, or at least I would want a space, an ideal world, where an African country could engage with the West, if that is what is most beneficial for this project, and then also engage with China as well. Something that we've seen from China is an openness towards engaging with different actors in terms of Africa's development. And this has also been something that Xi Jinping has been vocal about. Of course, in terms of the investment climate, there is a lot of, I would say, increased drive, for example, from other players such as the US, to kind of counter Chinese influence, and also have their, for example, Build Back Better initiative. A lot of investment they've put into the Lobito corridor in Zambia as well, and trying to have that footprint on the African continent as well. Some critics have critiqued them for having not an Africa-focused policy, but more anti-China-focused policy in Africa, which is not necessarily constructive for African development. So I would say it's very important for African countries to take that step back, understand who they're dealing with. There's a lot of different actors playing in different regions, and engage, for example, as a non-aligned movement would promote it, engage on what is the most beneficial for that country and not trying to be pulled into great power politics. But of course, that's much easier said than done and might be a bit aspirational. But that's how I would best recommend engaging with this increased geopolitical tension, at least from a state level side.
Actually, carrying on, about the Western financial system sort of versus China. And it's been a sort of topic, I think our audience in generally that people want to know, how genuine are China's efforts to move away from the Western controlled financial system? Is there any cooperation between China and Western financial entities in Africa?
I think so. What's very interesting for me in my research on China in Africa as well, and China in general, is, and you'll also see this in a lot of their policy documents, they don't want to overthrow the world governance structure and burn it to the ground, but they want it to reform in a way that is more equitable towards all countries involved. So it's only when China sees that they are not being heard that they will start making secondary institutions or parallel institutions such as the New Development Bank, for example, and kind of spearheading in that way and creating a new avenue. But if there's a possibility, for example, for UN cooperation, China has been a significant contributor, for example, to UN peace missions across the continent as well. So they also engage with these institutions. It's not as though there's this total disengagement. I think some interesting cases in an African context of cooperation would, of course, be some joint financing. For example, there has been instances where the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and EXIM, Chinese Export-Import Bank, would collaborate on projects. Another very prominent example, I would say, is the G20 DSSI, and later on the Common Framework for Debt Restructuring. This is something where China has engaged with a lot of Western powers towards restructuring debt and creating an environment that's better for the African country involved. So there's definitely this openness towards engagement. And like I mentioned earlier, this is also something Xi Jinping has mentioned in his speeches, this openness towards engaging with different partners and remaining open to various forms of cooperation when it comes to Chinese external engagement, but also African development in particular.
Right. Actually, in that context, what you're describing there, can you be, for the layman, for us laymen, we're wondering, what are the different investment structures that are being employed in Africa, like the public, private, foreign investment? I know this is definitely something that you're an expert in. Can you give us more clarity about that?
So I can do my best. I wouldn't call myself an expert in this exact structure, and there's a lot going on.
Modest.
But a few key things, of course, is your bilateral loans when it comes to China, Africa, which would be something as an African country, let's say Kenya, borrowing an X amount of money from China to construct a railway, for example, the SGR railway, standard gauge railway. So that's how that would work. Of course, just an interesting fact, which is almost going away from the question itself. But in a case like that, what happened is Chinese companies would then come in, construct the infrastructure, and then it would ultimately be handed over to the African government at a certain stage. So they provide the loan, but they're also part of the construction aspect of it. So kind of having that skills transfer into the community too. Very interesting, but it's a separate topic.
Yeah.
So then, of course, so you have your bilateral loans. Then you have your direct investment by state-owned enterprises into the African continent, just in terms of expansion of business operations, setting up shop. You, of course, have your increased almost greenfield investment in new areas where it's not necessarily just the company opening up a subsidiary, but opening up a new venture on the African continent. Then you have, of course, as you've mentioned, the public-private partnerships. I think this is a bit more of a complex structure in which local government can, for example, work with a firm like Huawei to have that expansion. And this goes back to our earlier conversation about Chinese companies and the different structure in terms of state ownership and also private ownership and their SOEs, given their own economic structures. So this would then come over to the African continent. And of course, this Chinese state is involved in it in the sense that they provide incentives for these companies to come over. So it's a complex web, but those are just a few of the areas of engagement that we've seen. Of course, then there are your bigger arrangements in terms of the new development bank, which is not necessarily China, that I'm sure you're very well versed with, that also have the capacity to give loans. So different vehicles in which these investments are being driven.
That's interesting. We actually have this issue in Australia with this public-private partnership thing, because in the Parliament we have Senate inquiries, so where the Senate sort of reviews what the government of the day is doing, and whenever the government of the day, I'm just using this example, right? It's been over a few years, this public-private partnership, but whenever the Senate does review, and the government doesn't really want to, cooperate, they say, "Oh, it's commercial in confidence. Sorry, we can't tell you anything," which is what you were just speaking to about transparency as well. And it's totally legitimate too, because the company does not want to have that be
Revealed.
disclosed. So, but it's let me read this one by Lim K. Only BRICS can foresee the projects that Africa is frankly needed for its progress. No other organizations are compelled to do it, from the decades shown. That's interesting. It's very pro-BRICS. Our audience is pretty pro-BRICS. So,
well, because now in BRICS, how many African countries we have? South Africa, Ethiopia.
No, definitely. I think it's a very interesting take. I tend to not agree, and of course this is just my opinion as someone that's very pro-African. I think the only person that can, or the only Africa can save Africa, and we need African solutions for African problems. Entities such as BRICS, and to an extent also the West, can provide vehicles to assist Africa in its development. It can provide tools, and I think the BRICS alliance can be a very valuable tool for Africa's development. But I always caution against, I don't think there's going to be any external savior of Africa. All of the initiatives need to be homegrown, and then we need partners from different sides of the geopolitical divide to get that accomplished. And I also think a lot of the issues that we've seen in terms of the lack of development that we've had, the internal issues that we've had, is because of a financial system that places higher risk premiums, for example, on African countries, and some exclusion in very important forums. So I think a broader conversation isn't just having increased BRICS membership from an African side, but having Africa actually determine what it wants and then seeking out partnerships that best serves those goals.
Yeah, it sort of brings up the subject of education. Here at the channel, we've partnered with BRICS University Association, and they've, I don't know if you've seen our previous video. I would encourage you to watch it, Jana, because you're doing your doctorate and in political science is quite relevant. But they're trying to get this connection and people to understand, the students to understand, the communities in those areas, that you need educated individuals to maintain and progress the development anyway. Exactly. And so yeah, we're trying to contribute to that as a media channel, as a media, which is a sort of different function. So yeah, we've got another one. I'm going to read it out. Yeah. Mubin Moidian. Wow. With what Jana said earlier, does it apply to municipalities in terms of loans for infrastructure? I think that is a question for you, Jana.
I think it's a very good question for me, and I wish I had a very good answer for it. This isn't actually something I've thought about, so it's a very good take on it. I think that would depend as well in what the governmental structure of that particular African country looks like. I oftentimes find myself on a very macro level analysis, but it's very important to remember that there is, of course, different forms of how governments would engage. Although we've seen that certain provinces, Chinese provinces, for example, would increase trade relations with African regions as well. So there's that kind of that mix coming from the Chinese side, but I'm not exactly sure. I don't think a municipality would necessarily have the legislative capacity to get into that level of a loan, but it would be very interesting. I'm not sure.
Funnily, sorry, I sort of taken, but we actually did a video about that, Jana, where we talked about Texas was going to become
BRICS member.
was going to do something. Yeah, Anastasia knows because she does all the research and does. But it was like, and then a province of Argentina as well, in southern Argentina, because I don't know why, but you know, I assume like countries in Africa, they want to develop, and it's like, well, where do we get the money and people that want to do it and the expertise and the resources? So anyway, you go ahead, Anastasia. What have you got? Technological or?
Yes, technological. We would like to talk about technology also in Africa, because me and Clive yesterday we were talking about today's discussion, and I shared my personal thoughts about African. And when we talk about Africa and we talk about technology, mostly the majority of people like myself, we imagine Africa is something, I don't know, that stands far away from technology, if we may say, because a lot of pictures on the YouTube, on the media, they show the picture of starving children, animals, lack of water, drinking water supply, lack of electricity supply, and so on, a lot of problems. And then there is technological advancement. And they say that when we're talking about Chinese money that are coming to Africa, they say also that China brings investments in digital infrastructure and technology sectors, of course. So how Chinese investments in digital infrastructure transforming African economy?
So I think it's a very interesting topic, and I recently did a book chapter on it. I just find it fascinating. So firstly, the first part of it in terms of Africa's own development landscape. I think there's a big discrepancy between, for example, urban areas and rural areas. There are very developed areas in Africa. For example, I'm sitting in South Africa in Pretoria, which is very much a metropolis. It's a big city. There's everything you could possibly need. So although there's a big divide between some areas having this, some areas not having it, I think there is a misconception in terms of Africa's development. So yeah,
because countries are very different. For example, Northern African countries, Central African countries, and South African countries that are at absolutely different levels. If we will take South Sudan, for example, or South Africa, that's
no, it's vastly different. So it's very difficult to talk in general. But what China has been doing in terms of addressing these problems, I think, is quite smart. So they have the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure you are familiar with. But then they also have a subsidiary of this called the Digital Silk Road. So this is expansion in terms of investment in fiber optic cables. This is investment in data centers, in computer literacy, in training for a lot of local enterprises. This even stretches as far as having AI and e-commerce coming towards the continent. So this is hard infrastructure development and then also soft infrastructure investments in terms of human capacity. A really cool project that I've also seen. So of course, when you have the conversation in terms of China's expansion in Africa and China-Africa trade divide, in terms of there's a big deficit. And of course, a lot of African products being exported to China is resource-based, which of course kind of increases this cycle of resource dependency that is something African economies want to move away from. And having products that they're ultimately exporting that are higher up the value chain. And this is kind of, sorry, it sounds like I'm taking the story very far, but I'm getting to the point. So in terms of this whole investment strategy, China, for example, has it's the Africa Digital Trade Week, in which they will have an opportunity for African small and medium enterprises to, via e-commerce platforms, also advertise their products to a Chinese audience. There's been like the electronic wall trade platform that the Chinese government has partnered with the Rwandan government to create that ultimately enables e-commerce from Africa to flow to China, to also have that type of trade that's more diversified in terms of African goods. So this not only addresses the issue of the digital divide in Africa, but it goes further into also addressing the trade deficits and having an opportunity for small and medium enterprises to ultimately also engage with the global economy. So that's kind of breaking a lot of barriers. So I think in terms of what the digital Silk Road is doing, that would be one of the standout things for me. Of course, then you have your big tech giants like your Huawei and your ZTE coming to the African continent and having that expansion. That is creating a lot of increased connectivity for a lot of Africans in rural areas. And although it sounds very, oh, they're building this data center, they're building this, this ultimately means an African child that now has access to the world of information. This means increased education. This means a lot of new financial opportunities opening up for a lot of isolated communities. So I think that's something China has been getting right in terms of their digital Silk Road in Africa and their investment in also Africa's connectivity.
Sounds cool.
Sounds cool.
It's very cool.
Nevertheless, it's worth mentioning that yes, the digitalization and internet and connectivity and information, but it's still all we should I don't know how to tell that correctly. When Clive was talking about education, I think the core of all that knowledge is study. What is more important to bring to African nations is the possibility to study, to learn, not only to consume.
No, definitely. But I think in terms of, it's very interesting. I think we have a lot of good African institutions as well. So that is something that we have on the continent, that we have our own knowledge production centers. So that's something that's very much coming from Africa and has to come organically from within. So I think we have a lot of our own knowledge structures. I think something in terms of, for example, digital connectivity is just an add-on, but of course we still have a lot of problems in terms of our own educational resources. What is part of, for example, China's Belt and Road, when they do invest in these communities, they'll also have a technical training center, for example, to train the local population and how to ultimately build infrastructure. Then, of course, there's increased people-to-people connection, which is having African students study at Chinese universities, for example. And I think this is something that is very central to Beijing's engagement with Africa, is also people-to-people connection. So it goes beyond having these big governmental level, but also ultimately fostering an understanding between everyday Africans and everyday Chinese citizens. So that, in that term, I would say the educational exchange programs are very good. And of course, they are essentially familiarizing a lot of students that would one day be higher up within the own government structures of their countries with Chinese networks and the way that business is conducted from that side. So it's kind of intrinsically creating these connections. Of course, you have the Confucian Institutes as well that has an increase of Chinese culture, Chinese language, bringing that to the African continent. So that type of development and cooperation is very prevalent. But I would say at the end of the day, also something China gets right is a respect for Africa's own intellectual autonomy and Africa's own knowledge production centers that we intrinsically have.
Yeah. So one of our viewers left a comment that China is giving to Africa a fishing rod, not a fish, but a fishing rod. And that's correct, in my opinion. Yeah, if you if you build a hospital, you have to fill it with the personnel, with the doctors, and without education, it's impossible to do. And when you mentioned about that students exchange, yeah, it should be. If you bring, this one, China is giving Africa the fishing rod. Yes, exactly. And it's very important. And involvement, Clive, we wanted to ask also about cultural and educational exchange between African nations, students, people, and Chinese communities as well. So
the BRICS Plus University Association, I showed in the video, they had a list of all the participating universities in Africa, and it just kept going. There was so many. Sorry to interrupt you, Anastasia, but I have to ask this. I'm 47, and I'm from the 80s, and we used to watch the commercials of, the decimated living standards of Africa. I mean, is it? And if you go into the rural Australia, I mean, people live like that in rural Australia. I'm just being frank; they do, right? It's like that. Do we have an outdated perception, do you think, Jana? Because you actually live in an African country. I know you live in a developed, but...
Yeah. I'm very well aware of, but even given like South Africa, which is where I'm from, which is one of the more developed countries in the region, you will be between beautiful mansions, beautifully developed areas, and all of a sudden you're in an area that's absolutely deprived of having water, or access to free running water in every house, having access to electricity. So that inequality within an African landscape is incredibly stark. And that's something that has to be kept in mind. I do think there's a very outdated perception of Africa and Africans. I think there's a lot of top-notch research coming from the continent, innovation coming from the continent. I think there is business initiatives, very much an entrepreneurial spirit coming from Africa as well. I think a lot of Africans and African countries are very determined to rise. So that perception of a very weak, very struggling Africa, I would say misses a lot of nuance into what it's like on the ground. Of course, there are areas that are very much lacking a lot of necessities and that no human should be living without. But of course, there's also very much development going on. So it's stark inequality. Yeah, I would say I very much simulate with what you said about Australia, that some areas there's a lot of issues and in other areas it looks a bit better.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. We got Mubin Moydian again. The biggest advantage Africa has would be its youth. We are a youthful nation. Exactly. South Africa has the most diverse cultures, literally the rainbow nation. That's interesting.
I completely agree with his statement on the youth. I would say it's probably one of Africa's biggest assets. Continuing when you look at why Africa is so important to a lot of external engagements, it is a large youthful population, which is in a lot of sense, it's human capital, it's capacity for development. So I completely agree.
Nice.
Yeah, because we know that the majority of African nations, they have very high percent of under 30 years old population. So if in confront to Europe, for example, where the majority of population is over 45.
Big
So,
difference.
yeah, it's a huge difference. And our listener is absolutely right that the youth is like a human resource. This is a big drive for economy as well. Because who's working? Young people. Who's consuming more? Young people. Who makes families, raise children? Young people. So this is not
That's the productive time. A very,
exactly.
very productive time in
Yeah,
life.
very productive time. Very productive time. So if there are investment, if there is an infrastructure, appropriate infrastructure, so it will be continuous growth for African countries, for all African countries, not only for South Africa or Ethiopia or I don't know Zimbabwe, but for all African countries.
Maybe you want to. We're getting up to about an hour, but I think we did want to hit on the human rights and sustainability or security. Do you want to do that one, Anastasia?
There is one question they
Yep.
want me to ask about young immigrants to Europe from African countries. Why? And what for?
Why are young Africans immigrating to Europe?
Yeah.
I think, of course, this is very much an individual context as well. It's not necessarily I can only speak as a young African myself. And it's very much sometimes the job opportunities you would have an amazing, for example, the unemployment rate in South Africa is very, very high. So you would have the great young talent, you will have the knowledge, have university graduates, and so there's a significant amount of unemployed graduates because there simply just isn't work. And I think a lot of times this flow of individuals from African countries towards Europe is ultimately in search of a better future. So that's, of course, that's very much washing over a lot of other issues. Of course, there is oftentimes forced migration, there is political instability, and people fleeing to have a safer environment. So I think it's a very diverse amount of reasons, but that would be one or two that I would give.
Well, I think if there will be a better atmosphere from political point of view, as you say, but the main reason is, yes, this is lack of job. So it's important to be, like we were talking with our guests, you remember, Clive, about the importance to be educated and employed in your own country, in your own city, in your own
Connection.
area. This is the connection the person should have. For example, the president of Nigeria, he asked for the young people who escaped from Nigeria to come back, because otherwise, who will develop the country?
Yeah.
Who? If everyone is looking for a better life abroad, who remains this way?
No, definitely. It's in South Africa, they call it, the term is brain drain, where you have like this influx of professionals just going abroad, going to Australia, for example. I know there's a big South African population moving to Australia, and this is all in response to our own political and economic problems. Of course, some environments would not be safe for Africans to return to. We know that there are conflicts on the continent. So that's always something to keep in mind as well. But yeah, it's very interesting, but migration really isn't my area of expertise.
No, as soon as we are talking about Africa and being right now in Europe, I see a lot of very young people who escaped. They're coming with boats, they're risking their lives. And unfortunately, some of them, they lose their life in the sea, in searching for a better life. And it's a pity to see this situation when we know that if there is a better I don't know, organization, investment from not from only from China, from other countries as well, that they will keep that people alive at home, being at home. So that's why I'm just I wanted to address this question.
That's a good
And
point. Absolutely.
and
No, go ahead.
now you wanted to ask about the question.
Yeah, to do well, human rights and
Oh, well,
sustainability or security. Um, how do China's investments in Africa address or conflict with human rights concerns, particularly in regions with unstable political climates? And you've sort of touched on this, Jana, but a bit more detail. What measures are in place to ensure the long-term security and sustainability of the projects?
So China has a different view of human rights than a traditional Western conception of it,
Mm.
in terms of they see it as almost the equivalent of a human right, the right to development, the right to an economic situation in which you can make a living for yourself, in which you aren't forced to move to another country to do so. So the Chinese view on security is very much intertwined with development, and we've seen this in the new Global Development Initiative that is accompanied by the Global Security Initiative as well as the Global Civilization Initiative. But kind of having this combination of approaches towards creating an environment in which there is a larger scale of development, where there's access to resources, and where there's less poverty. So, from that sense, I think China can make a very constructive contribution to the African continent. Of course, then there is the problematic aspect of the fact that China's non interference policy makes it very difficult. So, for example, if a country is being ostracized by the international community for human rights abuses, then China would still continue to have diplomatic relations with them because of the non interference policy. So, this can make it very difficult in an African context if the incentive to stop human rights abuses is lessened because the government of a country would still have the opportunity to engage with China, for example, which is a big flow of income. So that would just be one way. But of course, it's very much contingent on the circumstance.
That's very interesting because because China and the East has a different culture, which in the West we actually find very hard to understand. I personally don't, because my parents come from Mauritius. We understand that the East is an enduring culture, and I think people in Russia understand that because they sort of are between the East and the West. So it's a different culture, a different mindset, and maybe Africans feel from the China as a cultural thing. Maybe they feel that there's more conducive. I'm sort of speculating, but I wonder whether the culture aspect and the way they engage in this political economic context is maybe works better.
I think
mm,
that's very interesting. It's an interesting topic to delve into. I think something China is doing right, for example, with the Global Civilization Initiative, even the people to people exchanges, cultural exchanges, students coming here into that understanding is something that's increasingly being created. What we have seen is that there sometimes is a lack of, for example, Chinese business practices, or even a Chinese Mandarin language deficit on the African continent, in having
mm,
translators that can engage with these people. So I think sometimes the Western culture, in terms of pop culture, is better known to a lot of Africans because of just mass media and all of these different areas. But these new approaches by China to also have a soft power approach is kind of creating a better understanding of what the Eastern mindset looks like and what the Chinese mindset looks like, and also makes it easier to engage just on a people to people level, because at the end of the day, the people signing these contracts are just a person.
mm. I want to ask in closing, because we're sort of going over, but very general, and I know, as a professional, I know you don't. I'm hesitant to ask this, but I think I want to close off and ask, and please don't be glib. Like, please tell us honestly, because you're living in Africa too. Do you think China's engagement in Africa, has it been worthwhile? Is it more positive than negative, do you think? Or should they just leave and go, okay, no, let's just let Africa do what Africa does? Because that's come up a lot, right? We should have just let the people of Africa do what they want to do, with the colonial context, right? So not to get into that too much, but I'm wondering, what do you think?
I think the Chinese approach in Africa gives, like they said, a fishing rod. It's not giving a fish. And as long as the approach and engagement with Africa is in a space where it is giving tools and it's not prescribing what the African nation should do, because at the end of the day, no external power, not even me sitting in South Africa, can tell you what a Rwandan and how a Rwandan should be engaging in their economy. I think it's very important for Africa to have a collective response towards these external actors, especially when acting for like regional infrastructure projects and making sure that the countries are communicating with each other. But I don't think China is good or bad. I think China is what Africa wants it to be and how Africa chooses to engage with it. It has its pros, it has its cons, and at the end of the day, the important part is that policymakers understand what these are before going in, mitigate the risks as far as possible, and maximize the hell out of all of the opportunities.
Sounds good. Yeah. Well, Anastasia, if you've got anything else, we'll try and end off.
Just, Jana, just a few words about China-Africa Cooperation Summit that will be in September. We mentioned that in our initial video. So what is expected from that summit for African countries in general?
So, very much, of course, this will kind of set the tone for China-Africa engagement going forward. What I speculate will take place here is an increase, smaller projects, smaller, more green infrastructure investment, hopefully for the continent, which is something we very much need to meet our own sustainable development goals. I think there'll be an increased push for the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative and the Global Civilization Initiative. I think they'll very much be at the forefront, and we'll see a continued reform of the Belt and Road initiatives towards making it more sustainable, which is very much also responding to African countries' desires to have it be so and have it be more sustainable, more profitable, more green. So I think that's what we're going to see at this FOCAC.
Okay, let's see what will be in September. Because in September, from the 3rd of September to 8th of September, in Beijing will be this forum. Then in October, in the end of October, it will be BRICS Summit. So the autumn will be full of events.
It is going to be great. We're going to be...
Yeah. I think it will be a lot of news.
Yeah, we'll be talking about it, and hopefully, Jana, if, especially on the FOCA, if maybe we could do another episode. I don't mean to put you on the spot in front of everyone, but yeah. All right, awesome.
That would be great.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'll end off. So thank you for coming, Jana. I really appreciate it. Anastasia.
Thank you very much, Jana. Thank you, Clive.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Thanks for tuning in to BRICS Briefs. If you've enjoyed this episode and wish to join the conversation, you can comment below. Please like and share this episode to spread it as far as possible. You can follow us on our Substack and other social media platforms, especially Telegram, are all linked below. Stay curious, stay connected, stay optimistic, and let's keep exploring together. Tot sens.